northern Wisconsin, November 1891. The first snow had already buried the trails when Jacob Winter began stacking river stones in a clearing 12 miles from the nearest logging camp. His neighbors watched from a distance, shaking their heads. The Norwegian immigrant was building again, and this time they were certain he'd lost his mind. "That cabin won't fit a grown man's shadow," muttered Thomas Bradley, a timber foreman who'd spent 15 winters in these woods. He squinted at Jacob's foundation stakes. 12 feet by 14, smaller than most root cellars. But it wasn't just the size that drew ridicule. It was everything. The double walls, the excessive stonework, the ceiling height that would force a tall man to stoop. Every choice Jacob made seemed to contradict 2 decades of proven Wisconsin cabin building. They called it insane, backwards, a waste of good timber, and a guarantee of frozen death. What they didn't understand, what none of them could see yet, was that Jacob Winter had brought something from the old country that no American builder possessed. Not stubbornness, not ignorance, knowledge. By February, that knowledge would mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. It would produce numbers so dramatic that seasoned frontiersmen would question their own measurements. And it would prove that sometimes what looks like madness is simply engineering that's generations ahead of its time. Before we reveal exactly what Jacob built and why it worked, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether you're dealing with brutal winters or dreaming of off-grid life. Because by the end of this story, you'll know the precise measurements and techniques that kept one man warm while an entire community froze. And that knowledge might be more valuable than you think. The question that haunted that Wisconsin winter still echoes today. What did this solitary hunter understand about heat retention that entire logging communities missed? The answer would rewrite the rules of frontier survival. Jacob Winter was not a man who explained himself. When curiosity finally drove Thomas Bradley to Jacob's building site 3 days before Thanksgiving, he found the Norwegian on his knees, carefully fitting stones into a foundation trench that made no sense whatsoever. The trench extended 18 inches beyond where any logical wall would stand. "You planning to build a fort?" Bradley asked, attempting humor. Jacob didn't look up, planning to stay warm. The foundation itself was already an anomaly. Most cabins in this region sat on simple pier stones at the corners, maybe a few more along the walls if a builder felt ambitious. Jacob had created a continuous stone base, perfectly level, using river granite he'd hauled from the stream bed a quarter-mile away. 280 individual stones, fitted so precisely that Bradley couldn't slide a knife blade between them. But the real madness became apparent when the walls began to rise. Double walls. Jacob constructed an inner wall of straight pine logs, 8 inches thick, chinked with clay and moss in the traditional manner. Normal enough. Then, 8 inches outward, he built a second wall. Same logs, same chinking, creating a hollow space that seemed to serve no purpose except wasting lumber and reducing interior space in a cabin that was already criminally small. "That gap's going to fill with mice and rot," Bradley warned. "Every builder knows you want tight walls." "Every American builder," Jacob replied quietly, mixing clay with his bare hands despite the November cold. The correction stung. Bradley had built 17 cabins in Wisconsin and Michigan. He'd survived winters that killed lesser men. And here was this immigrant, a hunter who spoke broken English and worked alone, suggesting that American methods were somehow inferior. By the first week of December, the structure was complete, and the entire logging camp had found reasons to pass by and gawk. The dimensions confirmed their worst suspicions: 12 feet by 14 feet. 168 square feet of floor space. In a region where successful cabins typically range from 400 to 600 square feet, Jacob had built what looked like an oversized coffin. The ceiling sat at 6.5 feet. Tall men would need to duck. Above it, Jacob had piled nearly 2 feet of sod, creating a roof so heavy that he needed to double the roof beams. "Heating the sky," one logger called it. Others simply laughed. But it was the fireplace that truly sealed Jacob's reputation as a madman. He'd positioned it not against an exterior wall, as every sensible builder did, but in the cabin's interior corner. The firebox itself was small, barely large enough to burn 2 logs at once, and angled at precisely 45 degrees to the room's axis. The chimney rose through the interior space for 3 feet before turning and exiting through the roof. "You'll smoke yourself to death," Bradley predicted. "Chimneys go straight up through exterior walls. That's how draft works." Jacob tamped clay around the final stones of his firebox. "Draft works with heat. Heat rises. This chimney will give heat to the room before it escapes." "That's not how any of this works," Bradley said, his patience finally exhausted. "You've built a tiny, over-insulated, stone-heavy box with a fireplace that'll backdraft smoke into your lungs. You're going to freeze or suffocate, probably both, and we'll find you dead come spring thaw." Jacob stood, brushing clay from his hands. He was shorter than Bradley by half a foot, weathered by 40-some years of Scandinavian winters and American wilderness. When he finally met Bradley's eyes, there was no anger there, only a calm certainty that was somehow more infuriating than argument. "We will see," Jacob said simply. He moved into the cabin on December 11th, 1891. The logging camp took bets on how many days he'd last before crawling back to beg for shelter in a real cabin. None of them bet beyond spring. They were certain they'd be digging a grave. What Thomas Bradley and the other loggers couldn't see, what they'd walked past dozens of times without understanding, was that Jacob Vinter hadn't just built a cabin. He'd built a battery. The river stones Jacob had collected weren't random. He'd spent 6 weeks selecting specific granite pieces from the stream bed, testing each one by hand for density and weight. The lighter, more porous stones he'd rejected. The dense, heavy granite, the kind that made your arms burn after carrying just 2. Those he'd hauled back to his building site in a hand-built sled. 3,200 pounds of river granite. Measured on the timber company's scale, when curiosity finally overcame caution, and 2 loggers offered to help Jacob move what they assumed were foundation materials. They weren't foundation materials. Not entirely. The stone foundation extended 18 inches inside the planned cabin walls. When Jacob poured his floor, a mixture of clay, sand, and small stones, he created a surface that sat directly atop that thermal mass. Not separated by air or wood, but in direct contact. "You're making a cold floor," Bradley had warned. "Stone sucks heat right out of your boots." "Stone holds heat," Jacob had corrected. For a very long time. The fireplace told the rest of the story, though no one had bothered to examine it carefully enough to understand. The firebox wasn't just angled oddly. It was surrounded by stone on 5 sides, with only the front opening exposed to the room. Jacob had built a stone box within a stone foundation, and the firebox sat at its heart. Every fire would heat not just air, but 3,000 pounds of granite that extended under half the cabin's floor. The angle position meant that radiant heat from the fire didn't blast straight at one wall or escape directly up the chimney. Instead, it spread across the stone surfaces, warming the thermal mass that would, if Jacob's calculations were correct, release that heat slowly through the night and into the next day. But there was more. Details that wouldn't become apparent until the deep cold arrived. The chimney's interior path through the cabin, those 3 feet of stone and clay rising through the living space before turning outward, meant that heat traveling up the flue would warm the chimney mass before escaping. In a traditional exterior chimney, that heat was lost immediately to the outside air. In Jacob's design, the chimney itself became a radiator. On December 15th, for days after moving in, Jacob lit his first full fire. He burned it hot for 3 hours, feeding the small firebox with seasoned oak he'd split in October. The stone around the firebox grew warm to the touch, then hot enough that bare skin couldn't linger. The floor near the fireplace, that clay surface sitting atop 18 inches of granite, transitioned from cool to lukewarm to pleasantly warm. Then Jacob let the fire die completely. By his pocket watch, a silver piece inherited from his father, he measured what happened next. At 6 p.m., the last flame guttered out. At 10 p.m., the floor near the fireplace remained warm enough to sit on comfortably in wool trousers. At 2 a.m., it was still noticeably warmer than the floor near the door. At 8 a.m. the next morning, 14 hours after the fire died, the stone floor retained enough heat that Jacob could walk barefoot from his bed to the fireplace without discomfort. He recorded these observations in a small leather journal, writing in Norwegian. Numbers times sensations. The methodical documentation of an experiment that loggers would have called unnecessary in European. But Jacob Vinter had seen this principle proven in Norway. He'd slept as a child on sleeping benches built atop masonry stoves that held heat for 20 hours. He'd watched his father heat a 3-room cottage with less wood than American hunters burned in a single fireplace overnight. The knowledge wasn't new. It was old enough that Americans had forgotten it ever existed, if they'd known it all. What remained to be seen was whether 3,000 pounds of river granite, buried in Wisconsin clay, could do what Norwegian masonry stoves had done for centuries. Could stone remember fire long enough to outlast the deepest cold? Jacob suspected the answer was yes, but suspicion wasn't proof. For proof, he needed a test that left no room for doubt. A cold so severe that survival itself hung in the balance. He didn't have to wait long. On December 20th, Thomas Bradley finally accepted Jacob's invitation to inspect the cabin's interior. He had a duck to enter through the door. Once inside, he straightened and immediately felt the top of his head brush the ceiling. 6.5 feet of vertical clearance. For a man who stood 6'2", it was claustrophobic. "You've trapped yourself in a burrow," Bradley said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Because despite the low ceiling and cramped dimensions, the cabin was undeniably warm. A small fire burned in the corner fireplace, barely larger than a campfire, yet the entire space felt comfortable. Bradley unbuttoned his wool coat. Jacob sat on a simple bench near the small table that occupied much of the cabin's central space. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Bradley considered. His own cabin, which he shared with 2 other loggers, had a massive fireplace built into the north wall. They burned through half a cord of split pine just to keep the interior above freezing overnight. "Enough," he said carefully. "I burned this much." Jacob held his hands apart, indicating a space about 18 inches wide. 2 logs. Oak. For 3 hours. Then I let it die. That's not possible. You'd freeze. Touch the floor. Bradley knelt and placed his palm flat against the clay surface near the fireplace. It was warm, not hot, but distinctly warmer than any cabin floor he'd ever felt in December. He moved his hand toward the door. The temperature dropped, but even in the far corner, the floor wasn't the ice-cold surface typical of winter cabins. "It's the stone underneath," Jacob explained. "It absorbs heat when the fire burns, releases it slowly. The floor becomes," he paused, searching for the English word, "a stove. A stove the size of the cabin." Bradley stood, brushing clay dust from his hands. His engineer's mind, trained through years of practical building, began working through the implications. The small space meant less air to heat. The low ceiling reduced volume even further. The heavy sod roof prevented heat from escaping upward. The double walls, which he'd mocked as wasteful, created an insulation gap that trapped warmth inside. And the stone, 3,000 pounds of thermal mass that soaked up heat during the brief, hot fire, then radiated it back for hours afterward. "It's too small," Bradley said, but the argument sounded weak even to his own ears. A man needs space. Can't live cramped like a fox in a den. Jacob gestured around the cabin. A narrow bed against one wall. The table and bench. A small shelf for supplies. A corner for his rifle and traps. Everything a solitary man needed, arranged with Norwegian efficiency in 168 square feet. "Americans build big because they can," Jacob said quietly. "Norway, we have less timber, less space. We learn to build small and stay warm. Americans build big and burn more wood to heat air that escapes." The mathematics were undeniable, though Bradley resisted them. His shared cabin measured 20 by 24 feet, 480 square feet, nearly 3 times the floor space, with a ceiling that rose to 8 feet. Perhaps 6,000 cubic feet of air volume, all of which needed heating. Jacob's cabin contained maybe 1,100 cubic feet, tiny by American standards. But every cubic foot of that air could be heated thoroughly with a fraction of the fuel. What happens when the real cold comes? Bradley asked. When it drops to 20 below, 30 below. This trick of yours might work in December, but January and February will tell the truth. Jacob fed another split log into his small firebox. The fire accepted it quietly, flames wrapping around the oak with minimal smoke. The chimney draft worked perfectly despite its unconventional interior routing. Then we will see, Jacob said, the same words he'd used when construction finished. But now Bradley heard something different in them. Not stubbornness or blind hope. Confidence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into frontier engineering, do us a favor and smash that like button. Subscribe to see how this story ends. And drop a comment about the coldest winter you've ever experienced. Because what's coming next would test Jacob's design in ways that still sound impossible today. Bradley left the cabin troubled. He'd come expecting to find a desperate man making do in an inadequate shelter. Instead, he'd found comfort, efficiency, and engineering principles that challenged everything he thought he knew about winter survival. Back in his own cabin that night, feeding log after log into the massive fireplace just to maintain barely tolerable temperatures, Bradley wondered if perhaps the madman wasn't Jacob Vinter. Maybe it was everyone else. The temperature began falling on January 7th, 1892. Not the ordinary cold that Wisconsin loggers endured as part of winter's routine. This was different. The kind of cold that arrived with clear skies and absolute stillness, where moisture froze in the air itself and every breath burned in the lungs. By January 9th, the mercury in the timber camp's thermometer had dropped to 18 degrees below zero. By nightfall, it reached 23 below. The camp boss, a Swede named Larson who'd survived 30 winters in the North Woods, ordered all logging operations suspended. We stay near the fires until it breaks, he announced. Any man who thinks he can work in this dies stupid. The cabins became fortresses of survival. In a large bunkhouse, 16 men huddled around a central stove that glowed red from constant stoking. In the smaller cabins scattered through the timber claim, families and partners burned furniture when split wood ran low, rationing their supplies against a cold that showed no sign of breaking. Thomas Bradley's shared cabin went through 3/4 of a cord of wood in the first 24 hours. The temperature inside hovered between 8 and 12 degrees Fahrenheit. They wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered. Water buckets froze solid within an hour of being brought inside. Someone should check on Vinter, said Marcus, Bradley's younger cabin mate, on the morning of January 10th. The temperature had dropped to 27 below. That toy cabin of his can't handle this. Bradley stared into their fire. Watching valuable would burn away. They need to venture out to the woodpiles soon, and the trip, less than 30 yards, will be dangerous. Exposed skin froze in minutes at these temperatures. If he's alive, he won't leave his cabin to answer a door, Bradley said. If he's dead, he'll keep until the thaw. But the thought nagged at him. The Norwegian had been so certain, so calm in his peculiar confidence. And Bradley remembered the warm floor, the efficient little fire, the stone mass hidden beneath clay. Could it possibly work in this? On January 11th, with the temperature at 31 below zero, curiosity overcame caution. Bradley wrapped himself in every layer he owned, covered his face with wool, and made the 12-minute walk to Jacob's clearing. Smoke rose from the small cabin's chimney. Not the thick, desperate smoke of a fire being overstoked, but a thin, steady stream. Someone was alive in there. Bradley knocked. After a moment, the door opened. Jacob Vinter stood in shirt sleeves. His collar was open. He wasn't shivering. "Come in," Jacob said. Quickly, Bradley stumbled inside, and Jacob shut the door behind him. The difference was so extreme that Bradley's snow-crusted eyebrows immediately began dripping meltwater. He pulled down the wool face, covering, and stared. The cabin was warm. Not merely survival warm. Actually comfortable. "What?" Bradley's voice cracked from disuse and cold. "Ow!" Jacob gestured to the corner fireplace where a modest fire burned. 2 logs, not particularly large. The kind of fire you'd build on a pleasant autumn evening, not during a life-threatening cold snap. I burned hot yesterday, Jacob explained. For 4 hours. Oak and maple. Very hot fire. The stone, it drinks the heat. Now the stone gives it back. Bradley pulled off his outer mittens with shaking hands, shaking from shock now, not cold, and placed his palm against the floor. It was warm, more than warm. It was the temperature of sun-baked rock in July. This isn't possible, Bradley whispered. It is Norwegian, Jacob replied, as if this explained everything. Perhaps it did. Bradley moved to the cabin's center, the warmest spot, and simply stood there letting the heat penetrate his layered clothing. The temperature inside had to be at least 40 degrees. 40 degrees when the outside air was 31 below zero. A 71-degree difference. And Jacob was maintaining it with less fire than Bradley used to boil coffee. How much were you burning? Bradley asked. Since the cold began? 3 days ago. Jacob considered. Perhaps 1/4 cord. Mostly in the big burns. For hours each day, hot fire. Then I let it die and the stone works through the night. Bradley's cabin had consumed nearly 2 full cords in the same period, and they'd been miserable every moment. The mathematics were staggering. Jacob was using 1/8 the fuel and achieving temperatures 4 times higher. The logging camp needs to know about this, Bradley said. Families with children, they're suffering. If this design works, it works, Jacob interrupted gently. You are standing in proof. Outside, the wind began to rise. Not much. The deep cold rarely brought wind, but enough to make the timber creak. The temperature would drop further tonight. The weather signs suggested this cold snap might last a week. In cabins across the timber claim, people would burn everything burnable. Some wouldn't make it. Pneumonia, hypothermia, accidents caused by desperation. The killing cold claimed victims every year. But in this small, insane cabin that everyone had mocked, Jacob Vinter would sleep in comfort beneath a single wool blanket, warmed by 3,000 pounds of granite that remembered fire long after the flames died. The impossible numbers were real. The mad design worked. And Thomas Bradley, standing in shirt sleeves in the warmest cabin in Wisconsin while the world outside tried to freeze solid, finally understood what Jacob had tried to tell him months ago. Sometimes old knowledge isn't primitive. Sometimes it's just forgotten. And sometimes remembering it means the difference between life and death. By January 12th, word had spread through the timber camp like fire through dry kindling. Vinter's cabin was warm, impossibly warm, and he was using almost no wood to maintain it. Thomas Bradley had returned from his visit half frozen on the outside, but burning with evangelical fervor on the inside. He'd gathered the camp boss, 2 experienced builders, and anyone else willing to brave the cold for a demonstration that seemed to defy the laws of nature. 8 men stood in Jacob's clearing at 2 p.m., their breath forming ice crystals in the air. The official camp thermometer, a brass instrument from a Chicago supply house, read 29 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. 35 degrees below if you accounted for the wind that had picked up overnight. This is what he burns, Bradley said, gesturing to a small pile of split oak near Jacob's door. He'd measured it himself that morning. 7 pieces, each about 16 inches long, 5 inches thick. That's what he's burned in the last 12 hours. Larson, the camp boss, was skeptical. I burned 20 times that and woke up with ice in my beard. That's why we're here, Bradley said. He knocked. Jacob opened the door. Again, shirt sleeves, hair slightly damp from washing, looking for all the world like a man enjoying a mild spring day. Gentlemen, he said in accented English, please come see. They filed in, crowding the small space. The last man to enter carried the brass thermometer at Bradley's insistence. The warmth hit them like a physical wall. Marcus, the youngest logger, actually gasped. Sweet Jesus, he breathed. No blasphemy needed, said Jacob with dry humor. Only stone and fire. The man with the thermometer held it up, waiting for the mercury to stabilize. The cabin fell silent except for the quiet crackling of the small fire in the corner. 2 logs burned there, their flames modest and controlled. 41 degrees, the thermometer man announced. 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Larson did the mental arithmetic. That's 70 degrees difference from outside. 70 degrees. In a cabin this size, with that fire. He pointed at the fireplace. That fire wouldn't heat a chicken coop in this weather. The fire's only part of it, Jacob explained. He knelt and placed both palms flat on the floor near the fireplace. Touch this. One by one they did. The floor was hot enough that prolonged contact became uncomfortable. Not burning, but radiating steady, persistent heat. 3,200 pounds of river granite, Bradley said. He'd measured and calculated obsessively since his first visit. It sits under that clay floor in a continuous foundation extending 18 inches inside the cabin walls. The firebox is surrounded by stone. When he burns hot, really hot, for 3 or 4 hours, the stone absorbs that heat. Then it releases it over the next 20 hours. Thermal mass, said one of the older builders, a German immigrant named Friedrich. My grandfather built with it. Kachelofen, tile stoves. They worked on the same principle. Jacob nodded. In Norway, we call it peisoven. Same idea. Stone remembers fire. Americans, you burn hot fire all night. Waste wood, lose heat up the chimney. We burn very hot fire for short time, store heat in stone. Let stone warm the house. Larson knelt and examined the fireplace more closely. The chimney goes up through the interior first, not straight out through the wall. More heat stays inside, Jacob confirmed. Every degree that goes up the chimney, first it warms the chimney stone. That stone also gives heat back to the room. And the size, Friedrich said, understanding dawning in his eyes. It's not too small. It's exactly right. Less air to heat. Every cubic foot matters. The low ceiling, the double walls for insulation, it all works together. The demonstration continued for an hour. Jacob showed them how he arranged his fires, burning hardwood exclusively during the 3 to 4 hour heating periods. He explained the importance of the stone's thermal conductivity, why river granite worked better than limestone or sandstone. He demonstrated how the angled firebox directed radiant heat across the maximum stone surface area. But the numbers told the clearest story. Jacob's cabin, 41 degrees inside. 1/4 cord of wood in 3 days. 168 square feet of floor space. Bradley's cabin, 9 degrees inside. Nearly 2 cords of wood in 3 days. 480 square feet of floor space. Jacob was maintaining interior temperatures 32 degrees higher while using 1/8 the fuel in a space 1/3 the size. The efficiency wasn't just better. It was revolutionary. How long does the heat last after the fire dies? Marcus asked. Last night, I burned from 5 to 9, Jacob said. Let the fire die completely at 9. This morning it's 6. 9 hours later, the floor here, he touched the warm clay near the fireplace, was still warmer than your hand. By 8, I needed only kindling to build back up for the day. Friedrich was making calculations on a small notebook he'd pulled from his coat. If I'm understanding correctly, you're getting sustained heat for 14 to 16 hours from a 4-hour burn. The thermal mass is acting as a battery. A heat battery. Exactly, said Jacob. Larson straightened, his weathered face thoughtful. This cold snap will last another 3, maybe 4 days. Half the camp is burning through it faster than we can safely retrieve more. And we've got families with children. He looked at Jacob directly. Can this be replicated quickly? Can we convert existing cabins or build new ones? Converting is difficult, Jacob admitted. The stone foundation must be laid before the floor. But new cabins, yes. If you have stone and labor, a crew of 4 men could build one in a week. The camp has both, Larson said. And we have families that won't survive if this cold continues much longer. He turned to the assembled loggers. Bradley, Friedrich, you'll work with Winter. Tomorrow we start building. 2 cabins first for the families with youngest children. Then we see. As the men filed out, heading back to their frozen cabins with new hope and new knowledge, Bradley lingered behind. They called you mad, he said quietly to Jacob. The Norwegian smiled, a rare expression. They called me Norwegian. In America, sometimes this is the same thing. Not anymore, Bradley said. He extended his hand. Not after this. Jacob shook it. The knowledge is old. I only remembered it. And stone does not forget. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. By midnight, it would reach 34 below zero, the coldest night of the century for that region of Wisconsin. It would be a night of suffering for most, of desperation for some. But in one small, perfectly engineered cabin, Jacob Vinter would sleep in warmth, surrounded by 3,000 pounds of granite that held fire in its memory and released it as gently as breath. The impossible numbers had become irrefutable proof. The mad design had become a blueprint for survival. An American frontier building would never be quite the same again. Spring arrived late in northern Wisconsin in 1892. When the ice finally broke on the rivers in early April, the logging camp conducted its annual inventory. Wood consumption, equipment losses, structural damage from the winter's weight and cold, and casualties. 2 families had abandoned their claims in February, fleeing south to relatives in Milwaukee after burning through their entire winter wood supply by mid-January. One elderly logger had died of pneumonia complicated by exposure. He'd ventured out to his woodpile during the worst of the cold and gotten turned around in blowing snow. 3 cabins had suffered chimney fires from desperate overstoking. One had burned to the foundation. Jacob Vinter's cabin stood untouched, its occupant healthy, its woodpile still half full. But the real story wasn't about what Jacob had. It was about what had spread from his example. By late February, while deep snow still buried the trails, 4 new cabins stood in various stages of completion throughout the timber claim. Small cabins, compact, stone-heavy designs that drew openly from Jacob's blueprint. Thomas Bradley supervised 2 of them. Friedrich, the German builder, oversaw the others. The Halverson family moved into the first completed cabin on February 28th. They had 3 children under the age of 7. They'd spent January and early February huddled in a drafty 20-by-20 structure, burning furniture and fence posts to supplement their dwindling wood supply. The children had developed persistent coughs that worried their mother to the point of desperation. The new cabin measured 14 by 16 feet, slightly larger than Jacob's original. The stone foundation contained an estimated 4,000 pounds of river granite and limestone. The double-wall construction used recovered lumber from an abandoned claim. The ceiling height, 6 feet 8 inches. The fireplace, corner-positioned, interior chimney routing for the first 3 feet, surrounded by thermal mass. Within 2 days, the children's coughs began to improve. Within a week, the family was sleeping comfortably with a single bedtime fire that burned for 3 hours before being allowed to die. Mrs. Halverson, who'd been skeptical of the Norwegian design until desperation forced acceptance, told anyone who would listen that it was like living in a different world. The second family cabin, completed in mid-March for the Kowalskis, produced similar results. Warm floors, minimal wood consumption, interior temperatures that remained stable even when the fires died overnight. But it wasn't just families who paid attention. Trappers and hunters, men who lived alone or in pairs in the deep woods, far from the timber camps, began appearing at Jacob's cabin with questions. How deep should the foundation stone extend? What ratio of stone to floor space? Could you adapt the design for a 16 by 16 cabin, or did the efficiency break down at larger sizes? Jacob answered every question with patient precision. He sketched designs in the dirt. He explained thermal mass calculations using simple language and hand gestures when his English failed him. He never claimed ownership of the knowledge, never suggested that it was his innovation. It is old, he would say repeatedly. Very old. From Norway, from Germany, from Russia. Many cold countries know this. America forgot or never learned. I only remembered. By spring, 23 trappers and hunters within a 50-mile radius had either built or planned to build variations of Jacob's design. The logging camp itself commissioned 3 more compact cabins for the following winter, anticipating new families or workers who would need efficient, survivable housing. The designs evolved as different builders added their own refinements. Some incorporated sleeping benches directly over extended stone platforms, creating warm sleeping surfaces. Others experimented with soapstone instead of granite, finding that it held heat even longer. A few tried interior stone walls that doubled as heat radiators. But they all shared the core principles: thermal mass, compact volume, superior insulation, and strategic fire management. The principles Jacob had brought from Norway and proven in Wisconsin's killing cold. Thomas Bradley, who'd called the original design insane, became one of its most vocal advocates. He built his own compact cabin in April, 15 by 15 feet, with nearly 3 tons of stone in the foundation. When autumn arrived and the first cold nights returned, he recorded his results meticulously. Interior temperature with outside at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumption, 1/3 of his previous cabin. Heat retention after fire died, 12 to 14 hours of comfortable warmth. He sent his measurements to a building journal in Chicago, along with detailed sketches of Jacob's design. The journal published it in their November 1892 edition under the title Frontier Thermal Mass Construction. Norwegian techniques prove superior in Wisconsin trials. The article credited Jacob Winter by name. It sparked a small wave of interest among builders and engineers who understood that efficiency wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival, sustainability, and the intelligent use of limited resources. But perhaps the most telling moment came in December of 1892, almost exactly 1 year after Jacob had moved into his insane cabin. The timber camp held its annual winter gathering, a tradition where families and workers shared a communal meal before the deepest cold set in. During the meal, Larson stood and raised his tin cup in a toast. To Jacob Winter, he said, who proved that the old ways aren't backward. They're just older. And sometimes, being older means being wiser. The assembled loggers, trappers, and families raised their cups. Jacob, uncomfortable with attention as always, nodded quietly from his seat near the back. But later, as people filed out into the December cold, a young logger named Samuel approached him. Samuel had watched his father die of exposure during the previous winter, collapsing on the walk back from an outhouse in sub-zero temperatures. He'd been planning to leave Wisconsin, to flee south where survival didn't require such constant, desperate vigilance. Instead, he'd built one of the new compact cabins, and he was staying. "I wanted to thank you," Samuel said simply. "My father," his voice caught. "If we'd known last year what we know now," Jacob placed a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "The knowledge was always here. In stone, in fire, in the way heat moves through the world. We only had to remember how to see it." "How did you know to trust it?" Samuel asked. "When everyone said you were wrong. When they called you mad." Jacob smiled, that rare expression that made his weathered face seem younger. "In Norway, we have a saying, 'Den som ler sist, ler best.' He who laughs last, laughs best. But I did not need to laugh. The stone, it laughed for me. Every warm night, every morning with fire still in its memory. That was the stone's laughter. As winter deepened and snow buried the trails once more, the compact cabins scattered across northern Wisconsin glowed with warmth. Small structures that defied American conventions. Stone-heavy designs that seemed inefficient until you understood the physics. Tight spaces that felt luxurious when the alternative was freezing. Jacob Winter's insane cabin had started a quiet revolution. Not through force or argument, but through simple, undeniable results. 32 degrees warmer. 1/8 the wood. Families sleeping comfortably instead of desperately. Children growing up healthy instead of sick. The numbers had spoken louder than any words could, and they'd revealed a truth that applied far beyond cabin building, far beyond one Wisconsin winter. That dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours. That solutions born from necessity in harsh climates carried wisdom that convenience and abundance had allowed us to forget. That sometimes the most advanced engineering looked surprisingly simple. Because it was. Jacob Winter's cabin stood for 47 years. It was finally dismantled in 1939 when the last of the old timber claims were abandoned and the forest began reclaiming the clearings. But before it was taken apart, 3 different universities sent teams to measure and document its construction. The river granite in the foundation, after nearly half a century, was still perfectly fitted. The double walls showed minimal deterioration. The corner fireplace, with its interior chimney routing and stone surround, remained as efficient as the day it was built. The knowledge, like the stone itself, had proven durable. If this story of frontier innovation and forgotten wisdom resonated with you, here's what we need. Hit that like button to help this reach others who value practical knowledge over conventional thinking. Subscribe to this channel because we're diving deep into more historical survival techniques that modern society has forgotten. And drop a comment telling us what traditional building or survival knowledge from your own culture deserves to be remembered. Your ancestors knew things. Share them. Teach them forward. Because the next time someone calls an idea insane, the next time conventional wisdom dismisses an old technique as primitive, remember Jacob Vinter in his warm cabin while everyone else froze. Remember 3,000 pounds of river granite that remembered fire. Remember that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is stop inventing and start remembering. The hunter who built an insane compact cabin didn't just survive a brutal winter. He proved that old knowledge, tested by generations in the world's harshest climates, was never primitive at all. It was simply engineering that worked so well for so long that people forgot it was engineering at all. And that kind of wisdom, the kind that looks like common sense only after you've seen it proven, is worth more than any amount of modern convenience. Jacob knew it. The stone knew it. And now you know it too. This screenplay is educational and historical in nature. It does not replace professional engineering consultation or current building codes. Always consult qualified professionals for actual construction projects.